Welcome everyone. Welcome to the New York Botanical Gardens Science, Conservation and Humanities webinar, held in conjunction with this week's Earth Day celebrations. We are very happy that you are joining us online from various countries and across the United States for what will be an inspiring hour in which we will invite you and your participation in the future in plant research and the restoration of our natural environments. I am Vanessa Sellers, the director of the New York Botanical Gardens Humanities Institute, supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. With me is my colleague, Charles Zimmerman, the Collection and Outreach Administrator for the Garden's William and Linda Steer Herbarium. We are both delighted and honored to welcome today's presenters, Carissa Battle and Daniel Atta, who will speak about their current research in papers entitled, respectively, When Science Meets Activism, the Role of Monitoring and Restoration in the Data Revolution, and Documenting the 21st Century Flora, How Do We Keep Up? A short word about the speakers. Carissa Battle is a research ecologist and the founding director of Community Greenways Collaborative. She is focused on social ecological connectivity, network resilience, community science, and plant pollinator conservation. She manages the New York Phenology Project and works as a strategic advisor for organizations seeking to build capacity in the field of conservation, restoration, and education. Daniel Atta is botanist at the New York Botanical Garden, and he has conducted botanical fieldwork across the 50 states of the US and also across the globe in countries such as Vietnam, Bolivia, Mexico, Belize. He has published various books and numerous scientific articles, and in fact is about to publish a botanical inventory of New York Central Park. He co-manages the New York City Ecoflora, a community science project to document the wild plants in New York City. Now back to Charles for a few logistics.
Thank you, Vanessa. Before we begin, I just want to remind everyone, please keep your cameras off and your microphones muted for the duration of the presentations. After each talk, we'll open up the floor to your questions. You may add your questions to the chat at any time during the presentations, and Carissa or Daniel will answer them at the end during the Q&A. If you're experiencing any technical issues or have difficulty hearing, you can use the chat feature or send me an email. I'm going to put my email into the chat so everybody has it. As a reminder, this presentation will be recorded, archived, and shared online on the New York Botanical Garden Lecture Library. And with no further ado, please welcome Carissa Battle.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to yet another virtual meeting. I'm much rather be together today at the beautiful Botanical Garden. But on the bright side, some of us might be able to fold all of our laundry while we're talking today. So that's a plus, maybe. So I'd like to start on a more serious note by acknowledging that we are in a time of great suffering and hardship, and that this time period is rife with anxiety, and no amount of metaframing or taking the long view perspective can alleviate the grief that so many are enduring right now. So it's with that acknowledgement that I humbly ask that we do our best to hold that complicated duality of despair and hope tenderly in our hands as we speak today. And also consider that this time period is one of radical change in our relationship to nature. And we've had punctuated times like this in history before, where the collective energy around environmental preservation and consciousness has surged. And these have created valuable pillars that are serving us now in this time of crisis. And if we had more time, it would be interesting to create that timeline and pull out those examples. But since we're celebrating the 50th day, oops, hold on. I'm not able to advance my slides. Hang on a second. Okay, I can advance like that. All right. So since we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, let's start there and take a moment to consider the fear and the hope that permeated that decade leading up to 1970. And from that tumultuous time came the Wilderness Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and an official day to celebrate our planet, and really the birth of the modern environmental movement. And the committed work by countless people, of course, continued in the decades since. But unfortunately, that the conversation was too often overshadowed by big economic, political, and cultural challenges. So in recent years, we find ourselves again in a time of urgency and focus. Only now the stakes are even higher. So what's different now? How will we sustain the momentum this time for the coming decades? So I would ask you to consider the power and possibilities of community science as one of the most profound tools we have. Now, granted, science has always been done by amateurs. Don't like that word. And there are great examples of historic citizen science and community science projects from a century ago, or even 2 centuries ago, as I'll talk about soon. But what I mean here is the novel ability to aggregate large amounts of data collected by the crowd. What I mean is communities and entire regions taking action, building pollinator pathways and community gardens and backyard habitat without municipal support or incentive, creating online tools and resources to share best practices. What I mean is the confluence of restoration and monitoring, which can really allow for this feedback loop of adaptive management without the need for huge grants that end when where projects end when the grant runs out of money. In the past, our choices around these two conservation tools, restoration and monitoring, were often binary. Do we put the money into a restoration project and plant lots of things or pull invasive species, or do we put the money into funding a scientist or two or an agency to monitor a particular system? And the reason we don't have to make those kinds of choices as much now is because we're in the midst of a data revolution, and data generated by the public can be actively contributed through citizen science platforms or passively contributed through mobile phones and low-cost sensors and the like. And so there are countless projects to participate in, and there are tools to even create your own SciStarter, for example. And you can do this without large funding streams if there's a local issue that has your attention. So, for example, within weeks of the coronavirus pandemic, community science projects were launched all around the world, and data has been really flowing in ever since. And restoration as well. Restoration projects with meaningful outcomes launched by communities without major funding streams are also proliferating across the globe. I threw up this map just as I couldn't make it interactive, but it was really inspiring to see these restoration or regenerative projects all across the globe. If you need a dose of inspiration, I recommend going up to this website and checking out these expansive projects. And restoration is really now a global focus. And launched by the United Nations, this decade on ecosystem restoration is really a global call to action and is pulling together scientific research, political support, and financial power to really scale up restoration efforts from successful pilot initiatives to areas of thousands of square kilometers and millions of hectares. So I've been using this word restoration. In the past, this word was often meant to characterize returning an ecosystem to a perceived historic state or pristine state. And I think now more this word is really used to describe restoring an ecosystem's ecological functionality and to improve the capacity for ecosystems to be sustainable and to meet the rapidly changing needs of society. And this form of ecosystem restoration is absolutely fundamental to achieving the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which were ratified in 2015 as part of the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And for the first time, scientists are really pushing for community science data to be used to contribute to this global data gathering process, which is normally extremely costly, very slow moving, and the data becomes outdated, as soon as it's published, really. So community science is really a game changer in terms of collecting data to reach these SDG targets. Another way where you can really see our changing relationship with nature is in our language use. And even in these global scientific reports, we're seeing a lot more language. In the past, the ecosystem services framework was more firmly rooted in the natural sciences. And now we're seeing much more explicit embracing of concepts of other worldviews on human-nature relationships and traditional and indigenous knowledge systems. So you can find words and concepts like Gaia and Mother Earth and symbolic meaning and cultural identity. And there's also much more of an explicit acknowledgement that our own physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual well-being is directly tied to nature. And you can see this in this confluence of human health and ecological sustainability can be seen in this accelerating field of planetary health, which is really a transdisciplinary system that brings the best of the natural sciences, the social sciences, and public health sciences together and to work on global solutions together. And that practitioners and experts from those respective fields are finally at the same table, or at least at the same conference. And this fundamental shift in our worldview has really been brewing for some time. You really can't even think of ecological sustainability without thinking of human health, and vice versa. And now, especially as our activity slows and we're seeing the planet respond with clearing skies and clean water and having the opportunity to do some more self-reflecting about our relationship with nature, I think this worldview is shifting at an unprecedented rate. So let's bring this back to our homes and gardens and communities and invoke our favorite topic here at NYBG, which is plants and their many wondrous pollinators. So I know I might be biased on this front, but I do feel that one of the fields that is exemplifying this confluence I've been mentioning above the most elegantly is the fields of plant pollinator conservation. And there are so many wonderful examples globally, nationally, and locally of networks of activity that are supporting native plants and pollinators. And these efforts are really making a difference ecologically. Recent studies have shown that cities where people are restoring native plants are showing, and pollinator gardens and the like, are really showing increased species richness, bee species particularly. And these efforts have a mutual benefit on human health. Think about what it means for us to be outside, building schoolyard gardens and community gardens. And these activities put us in direct contact with the natural world and allow us to feel we're contributing and that we're connected to the whole of life, which is, of course, physically nourishing, but is also certainly an antidote to loneliness and despair. And the act of going out into the field to observe phenology, for example. So going out to track the timing of a flower bud opening, or waiting for the first red-winged blackbird to arrive in your area. This activity is one that develops incredible observation skills, and it's really like a mindfulness practice. And these are ways to engage as an activist without having to engage in political discourse and divisive politics. And the very act of working with these conservation tools are acts that support our own flourishing while supporting the flourishing of other organisms. And the wonderful thing is that we can contribute with activities that we're already doing, and ones we already love, like gardening in our own yards. And we can contribute by tagging one species in front of our house and submit meaningful data. And we can put one small pollinator garden in, and that green space becomes part of this mosaic of connected green spaces across a landscape. And if folks are out there monitoring phenology, so tracking the timing of organisms' life cycles, and also folks are out there, let's say with iNaturalist, snapping photos and seeing where species are, that's the spatial connectivity. And these two things together can really give us a clear sense of where we need to direct conservation attention, and we can really respond at a grassroots level. And this is adaptive management at its best. And it's really driven by social capital. And these efforts are truly democratic in that anyone can participate. This is my most devoted data collection assistant, finding the first red trillium flower bud just last week. So I'm going to get specific now and highlight an example of a project that really blends monitoring and restoration, education and stewardship, and uses data collected by community scientists here at NYBG and across the state. So the New York Phenology Project is a networked community science initiative focused on monitoring phenology to document ecological impacts of climate change. And we are a geographic affiliate of the USA National Phenology Network, a really wonderful organization. And we're a conglomerate of many different types of institutions and groups, from nature preserves to schools to research institutions and individual backyards. And the origins of this actually began in another city where I wanted to track plant pollinator connectivity across an urban to wild gradient, and knew I would need community scientists to be able to accomplish this. But at the time, there were no studies to evaluate untrained scientists' potential for this type of data collection. And so I built this phenology trail with colleagues, and we tested the newly developed protocol from the National Phenology Network, which had launched a few years earlier. And we were absolutely astounded by the level of accuracy from the citizen scientists. I think at the time I was coming from still a little bit more of a traditional scientist perspective that assumed that scientists had the market on accurate data collection, but really realized that citizen scientists did an amazing job, and we were able to help NPN refine their protocol as a result. And so as I was doing this project, some interesting things came up where folks were interested in using the phenology trails for more than just this data collection, for education, for training purposes. And so when I moved back to New York, I had a sense of what the value proposition would be for a more large-scale community science effort. And so as I began to map out the region for a pilot, two things really helped accelerate this network formation. One was that the New York Botanical Garden already had a really incredible phenology monitoring program. And the other was that there was a consortium or a group of institutions in the area interested in launching a consortium. And so we were able to launch NYPP at the same time and get things up and running quickly. So we set up physical sites, we built a website, put up resources, sites began contributing their own training materials, and other institutions across the state were starting to adopt. And the interesting thing is that at first, I was involved in most of these adoptions. And after a while, folks started to just do it themselves with the resources on the NYPP website and the NPN website. And so it became a self-replicating network, and many of the citizen scientists here today have been trainers for this program and beyond. And all the while, the amazing folks at NPN have been responding to stakeholder needs and building more and more functionality to help individual observers and groups like NYPP flourish and expand. And it's been a beautiful example of collaboration and mutual growth. So I tell you this formation story to illustrate that large-scale data aggregation platforms like NPN's Nature's Notebook and iNaturalist are tools that can provide an amazing framework and head start for initiatives that can then amplify the power of community science. And it usually just takes an organization or an individual to be a network catalyst that can move between different stakeholder groups and be a boundary spanner across discipline to link the different nodes of the network and help it come alive. And so that's what happened with NYPP, and this network grew rapidly. New sites, new projects, and pilots that we were able to blend management and restoration. An example is piloting the sites to monitor the timing of hemlock woolly adelgid, which is an invasive species affecting our native hemlocks. And this was to create a biocontrol calendar to help manage the spread of this invasive species. Another example is the Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge Pollinator Phenology Garden, where rangers working with students can monitor phenology and pollinator activity to help inform their restoration efforts. So while this was all going on, I ended up getting an astounding phone call one day from folks at the Hawthorne Valley Farmscape Ecology program who told me an incredible thing. And that is that they had discovered a weather and phenology data set from the early 1800s that spanned almost 50 years. There were over 100 observation sites across New York State with entries for over 800 plant and animal species. And they were actually monitoring some of the same species we were monitoring. This effort was championed by Simeon DeWitt, who was head of the New York State Regents, who gave a mandate to institutions and academies, which were kind of like vocational schools of the time, to monitor weather patterns and phenology. And the data collectors were largely non-scientists, staff, and students associated with the institutions. Sound familiar? And so the purpose of this network was really pretty practical, and it was to observe patterns in the natural world in order to help with decision-making around agricultural policy. The Smithsonian adopted the idea and protocols in 1849 and took over long-term management of the project and expanded the meteorological data collection across the country, which actually laid the foundation for what's now the National Weather Service. And so there's a long history of amateurs, there's that word again, collecting phenology data and a precedent for this historic modern phenology comparisons. And the results of some of these landmark studies have been vital to tracking species response to climate change. And so this data set had potential to answer even new questions because it spanned such a large region and had multiple sites and was over such a long period of time. But it needed a modern data set to unlock its value. And so Hawthorne Valley and CGC began the hard work of collaboration. And there were many decisions to make to be able to compare apples to apples, no pun intended. Botanical names were different, language was different, and there was much to decipher and digitize. And this process was actually quite a lot of fun, but it did take a long time. Like, children were birthed in the time span it took to get this data prepped for analysis. So our questions were designed as the first broad-scale pass to evaluate species change over time and to see if species change was associated with warming temperatures, which species were responding most and least, and whether there was variation related to things like seasonality and pollination syndrome. And I will spare you the details of the analysis and just say that we ended up with enough data for a robust analysis. And I'll just highlight a few specific results. So first flower date has advanced by about 11 days on average since the historic time period, and first leaf date by more than 18 days. The region's data added 35 years of previously unknown temperature data, which allowed us to construct this time series dating back further that was on than was on record. And we determined that the temperature warmed by 2.5 degrees Celsius in New York City, and determined statistically that most of the phenological change was indeed driven by warming mean spring temperatures over that time. And so all total, about 80% of the species we analyzed showed advanced flowering and leaf out to some degree. And there are many implications to this ecologically, but to keep it focused on pollinators, some of these plants showed change earlier leaf out or flowering of 3 weeks or more. And pollinators and herbivores, particularly specialists, are vulnerable to mismatch. And so, for example, spicebush, which is the species up in the top left corner, is the obligate host of the spicebush swallowtail caterpillar, and that leafed out 27 days earlier. Red maple is a critical early season nectar source for many native bees particularly, and that is flowering up to more than 2 weeks ahead. Milkweed, of course, crucial to the monarch butterfly, flowering 13 days earlier than in the past. And other studies are confirming these changes and using actually NPN data and even the data from New York in this example of milkweed to confirm this relationship between earlier temperatures and earlier flowering times. And so we did also find differences in pollination syndrome overall, where insect pollinated trees were advancing more than wind-pollinated trees. And so knowing which species are more responsive than others to temperature changes or most vulnerable to mismatch can really help direct conservation and further research attention. And so there were limitations to this data set for sure, but also so many possibilities for future learning. So I will definitely keep you posted as we continue this work. So I thought it would be fun to look at some of the things that were happening in New York City in the 1800s. And it's pretty dramatic if you compare it to this year. So some of you phenology observers out there at NYBG or in New York City, think about when you saw red maple first flower this year. It looks like at NYBG, the red maple flowered at the end of February. And if you look at this in the 1840s, the red maple flowered on April 22nd. So that's an enormous difference. So we know that that spring was particularly early this year. And these early springs are projected to happen now every 3 years or so on average. And knowing how organisms are responding to early spring is critical to management and restoration. So, for example, in some areas, there are nectar gaps at certain times of the growing season where it's hard for pollinators to find forage. And so tracking these blooms can help us know which flowers we should be planting in our restoration efforts. So if you are so inclined to monitor phenology, there are incredible resources on the USANPN site as well as NYPP to help you get started with phenology monitoring if it's new to you. It really is, it's simple to get up to speed. There's mobile apps. It's something you can do right in your yard. You can tag one handful of species and be contributing meaningful data. And it's actually a really joyful activity. My family and I do it pretty much every day. We've got a suite of species tagged around our property, and it's really an incredible way to be connected to nature. And so as I worked with this old data set, I was constantly reminded of what it takes for networks to thrive. I thought about the hundreds of people in the 19th century out there day after day, collecting this data, writing it on parchment paper, and using horse and buggy to move materials and communicate over large distances. And I was full of deep admiration and respect. Almost 200 years later, we're experiencing the benefits of their dedication. And our modern citizen scientists at NYPP and all other citizen scientists for that matter are creating data sets now that will be just as invaluable to future stewards. So in closing, I'd like to acknowledge that we are indeed living in a new age. And even before the pandemic in recent years, we've really had to turn our attention to figuring out how to navigate the Anthropocene, which is the term to describe that we're living in an era where there is no such thing as nature without humans, and that our impact is pervasive and long-lasting. And in some ways, this is a deeply disheartening thought. But in other ways, it's actually a deeply liberating one. The idea that there was pristine nature without humans and that the human-built world was unnatural has long been a construct that's allowed us to think of ourselves as separate. And, knowing that we have the power to ruin the planet, to put it bluntly, has conferred on us now a profound responsibility. And this acceptance can really serve us and fuel our efforts. And we're learning during this time, staying at home, that we can connect with nature through our window or in our yard. We can relate to that one tree outside our house by observing it in a way we never thought to before. And we're showing up as a global community, and we have more tools than we've ever had before to build planetary health and work towards ecological sustainability. So thank you for your work. Thank you for listening today. I hope you got all of your laundry folded, and please stay safe.
Thank you so much, Carissa, for that very inspiring, very humbling, but very important presentation that we all need to hear right now.
You're welcome.
So at this point, it's time for the Q&A. Anyone who has a question, would like to speak out, you can click the raise hand button on your screen if you can find that. Otherwise, just type hand into the chat, and we'll call on you, and you can unmute yourself and ask Carissa your question on your own. Otherwise, just enter your questions directly to the chat and we'll read them aloud for her. So we actually already have a few questions submitted. Carissa, Victoria asks, is the New York Phenology Project only in the city?
No, it's actually across the state. I'm sorry, can you hear me? I'm just making sure my microphone is unmuted.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yes, so it's across the state. There are quite a few sites in New York City. If you go on the New York Phenology Project website, there is a whole drop-down menu where you can see the different regions and the locations where some of the monitoring sites are right now. I see another question about elementary students getting involved and teachers. And yes, there are quite a few examples of teachers using Nature's Notebook in the classroom. And both through the NYPP website and the USANPN website, there's a host of amazing lesson plans and resources for teachers to involve kids in setting up a site. It's across the country, it's everywhere. So you can find examples of incredible projects all across the country.
Sandra mentioned that amateur is from the French, the lover of. So the true meaning is still very complimentary, although now we do use that term. We think of other things sometimes, but.
Yes, well, I am so happy to hear that because I have such a shudder when I hear that word because of how it can be used so negatively. But now I have a different feeling about it. So great.
Olga asks, how do you relate this data with New York State urbanization?
So actually, that was one thing we did also look at in the historic study, but you can also look at it just from the modern perspective because there are sites, if we're thinking just in New York right now, because we have this gradient of sites from the city to rural places like where I am in the Catskills and beyond, we can really do these comparisons. So in the historic data, we did also find that urban areas now and then, if we use those and compared them to their corollary rural counterparts, that the urban areas are advancing more than their rural counterparts. And if you look at the data just in terms of the modern times, you can really see that urban to rural gradient where things in New York City are happening way earlier than they are up in the Catskills. When I'm starting to track my red maple every day, sometimes multiple times a day, right around the time I know it's going to start the bud is going to start swelling, I start like harassing people at NYBG, particularly to find out, exactly how swollen are their red maple buds and when are they going to pop, because I know that they're going to get there, for way sooner than I am. And it gives me something to look forward to.
That's excellent. Someone anonymous asks, are there any phenology trails on Long Island?
Yes. So there are you can look up again on NYPP to look at the projects that were started there. But the South Fork Natural History Center in Southampton, they've got a neat phenology project going on there as an example. And there are a handful of other ones as well.
So if there are no more questions, we are going to transition over to Daniel Atha. Daniel is going to lead a talk titled Documenting the 21st Century Flora. How do we keep up? I'm going to transfer him over so he can load his presentation. Hi, Daniel. Hold on.
Hi, everybody.
Hi there.
Hi. Can you see my screen?
We see your PowerPoint screen, correct?
Okay. Let's see. Bear with the technological steep slope learning curve here. Okay. Can you see the first slide of the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Great. And you can see me okay?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Well, let's get started. Great. So I want to thank Charles Zimmerman and Vanessa Sellers for hosting this event, and want to congratulate Carissa on a terrific talk, giving the broader perspective, the whole global perspective of citizen science, the importance of the work, and the deep dive into the phenology research that's been conducted for 150 years or 170 years now in New York State. So I think here in New York, we're been the leaders in phenology research for more than a century, and with Carissa's great work, we're continuing that leadership role. So now to take it to even a more focused level, I'd like to invite you all to my presentation on the EcoFlora project in New York City. And the title of my talk is Scaling and Expanding the EcoFlora Model for Citizen Science Engagement. The New York Botanical Garden is an advocate for the plants and fungi that produce oxygen, clean water, and hold the soil. They give flavor to our food and provide inspiration to our cultural lives. As a scientific collections-based institution with some of the most comprehensive botanical resources in the world, the New York Botanical Garden is uniquely capable of providing the community with science-based information on plants and their ecological dynamics, informing management and policy so our planet can be managed wisely and sustainably. Did you hear my cat meowing? The New York City EcoFlora combines the New York Botanical Garden's historical strengths in collections with emerging opportunities in digital technology and community science to maximize the impact on plant conservation in New York City. Many of these features that Carissa focused on. All New Yorkers are invited to participate as community scientists to observe and collect and compile information about the city's plants and their relationships with other organisms, such as birds, insects, and mushrooms. Superimposed on this wonderful map of the world from the National Geographic Society is a graph of the number of organisms present on Earth over the last 500 million years. Immediately obvious is a lot of fluctuation or periods of rapid evolution and rapid extinction. These fluctuations can be grouped into 5 mass extinction events, where approximately 75% of the species present at that time were wiped out in a relatively short period of several million years. What is remarkable to me is that following each of these mass extinction events, the diversity of life came back greater than it was before. The trend is always upward. The last dip on the right, which you can see near Australia, is the 5th mass extinction event, when the dinosaurs were killed off about 60 million years ago. The very tip of the line on the far right of your screen represents the last 10,000 years, is called the Holocene, during which the Earth achieved its greatest diversity of marine and terrestrial life. You can see that the diversity of life is 3 times greater than the average over the 5 billion year history of the Earth. The Holocene was marked by a relatively mild climate across much of the Earth, with a protective atmosphere of 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and 0.04% carbon dioxide. We all know that that number is changing. Scientists tell us now we are now in the Anthropocene, which Carissa also mentioned, a geologic age so dominated by humans that our presence will be detectable in the rock strata millions of years from now. There is debate about the exact beginning of the Anthropocene. Some say it was 1850, others more recently, but it's safe to say that we are the only creatures in the 4 billion year history of life on Earth that has witnessed the transition from one geologic epoch to the next. We set out to conquer nature, and in the process have unleashed the 6th mass extinction that threatens to take all life to extinction. Ecosystems, species, and life-sustaining processes are being pushed to the brink of total collapse. Plants, animals, fungi, and untold microorganisms are going extinct at 10 to 100 times the natural rate. We've all heard the numbers. 30% of birds are gone. Amphibians are on their way out. Corals are dying everywhere. 70% of insects in many places are now gone. Alaska is on fire, and the Amazon is drying up. Pandemic diseases are increasing, as we tragically are experiencing today. We are realizing that to conquer nature is to commit ecological suicide. Crucially, this realization comes at the nadir of our connection to nature, when fewer and fewer people recognize or know hardly anything about the plants, animals, and ecological processes around them. It has become so pronounced, the subjects of this article in the Wall Street Journal, PhD agriculture students, couldn't even recognize the actual plants they were researching in the laboratory. At the New York Botanical Garden, we've been conducting research on plants and fungi for 128 years, amassing the largest collection of preserved botanical specimens in the world, second largest, little slip there, educating generations of scientists and promoting plant conservation around the world. Building on the institutional strengths of the garden's library, herbarium, and scientific staff, the New York City Ecoflora is leveraging technologies like mobile computing, social media, photography, and GIS to build the most comprehensive assessment of the native and non-native wild plants of New York City ever assembled. We are bringing big data to botany at a pace needed to keep up with the Anthropocene. Darwin was driven by a sense of adventure and great curiosity, another, quote, amateur or lover of nature, one of the original citizen scientists, Charles Darwin. Darwin was driven by the same sense of adventure and great curiosity, the same motivations that inspired the founders of the High Line to explore an abandoned railway in the meatpacking district of Lower Manhattan. Nearly everyone who visits the High Line Park today, which is one of the most widely visited parks in the world today, says, wow, I wish I could go back in time and see what this park was like before it became a park. Well, New York City is full of High Lines in every neighborhood. They're in every borough waiting to be discovered and explored. In this image, we see Ecoflora volunteers observing ailanthus trees along Newtown Creek on the border between Brooklyn and Queens. On the day we visited, we found several monarch butterfly caterpillars and the five-angled daughter, a New York State rare species. Field trips like this and other Ecoflora events bring people together to explore the city and the amazing diversity hidden in every neighborhood. They also provide an opportunity for us to learn from each other, share stories, and strengthen community bonds around our love for nature. Working with professional researchers, community scientists have made important natural history discoveries. Suzanne Dickerson, a resident of Colorado Springs, trained a backyard webcam on a visiting skunk and discovered the animal using a rock to break the ice in the dog dish on her back porch so that the skunk could drink water in the wintertime when it was frozen. She shared her findings with local researchers, and together they published a paper on the first example of tool use in skunks. Really amazing discovery made by someone in their back porch. Eve Levine, a resident of the Upper West Side of Manhattan, discovered a wild spurge plant near her mother's apartment and posted her observation to iNaturalist, a free, non-commercial biodiversity program. Her plant was identified by Nathan Taylor, an expert in that plant group, 3,000 miles away. When I saw Eve's observation on iNaturalist and Nathan's identification, I realized the plant had never been seen wild anywhere in New York State. Within days, the three of us published a paper together documenting its presence in New York State for the first time. For those who want to take their enthusiasm and curiosity about nature to another level, the New York Botanical Gardens Adult Education Department offers courses throughout the year with in-depth instruction on the birds, insects, mammals, and ecological communities throughout the city. We are training a corps of super urban naturalists who will monitor the biodiversity in their communities and help their neighbors engage with nature. I believe this weekend there's a wonderful course on birds that you can sign up for. The Neighborhood Naturalist Program, pioneered by the New York City EcoFlora Project, are neighborhood groups that meet regularly to discuss local biodiversity concerns. Because nature has no seat at the table, neighborhood naturalists act as the voice for nature in their communities. They help educate their neighbors and inform policymakers who rarely hear the plant or animal's perspective. Recognizing that most environmental degradation happens at the local level, neighborhood naturalists attend local board and council meetings and speak out when nature is threatened and when there are opportunities for positive change. To date, the Upper West Side Neighborhood Naturalist Group has promoted the use of bird-safe glass in new construction, the use of native plants in landscaping, and the recognition of light pollution as harmful to insects and other animals. They are a regular presence at board meetings, and they faithfully advocate for nature at every opportunity. The New York City EcoFlora is the first of its kind, real-time flora built by scientists and sustained by community participation. With our botanical garden partners across the country, represented by the logos you can see here, we are building the scientific literacy and community engagement needed to protect our wetlands, our forests, and our urban spaces that support life. It is a global model for documenting biodiversity and ecological dynamics to build a sustainable future for the inspiration and well-being of all creatures on Earth. We are grateful to the Institute of Museum and Library Services for their generous National Leadership Grant to the New York Botanical Garden, supporting the New York City EcoFlora project. Thank you for listening, and I'll be glad to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Does anyone have any questions?
Any questions about anything? You could, I guess, go back to Carissa too, if possible. Please repeat the name. Oh, Charlie, do you want to
Sure.
moderate the questions?
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
Sandra just asked to repeat the name of the endangered species you mentioned. Five-ankle dodder?
Right, five-angled dodder, like a pentagram. It's for the shape of the flower. When viewed in cross-section, it has 5 angles around the flower. It's a species of dodder, Cuscuta pentagona, which means 5-angled. Pentagona, 5 angles. and it's a daughter species, often considered a weed. They're these orange strings that you might see out in nature that grow over plants. They're actually parasites that have these specialized root structures called haustoria that penetrate the epidermis of a plant and derive nutrients from the plant, but they don't kill the plant. They're a symbiotic mutual relationships with their host plants, and often the daughter plants are very specific about the species that they will live on. So it's a native species, sometimes considered a noxious weed, but it's actually a native species that evolved with the species that it parasitizes, and so it's a natural part of our ecosystem.
Great. We've got a long string of questions now coming in, Daniel.
Okay, they're flooding in. Took them a minute to think of them.
So Stephanie asked a great question. How does one begin to participate in the EcoFlora project?
Great question. So you could start out by going to nybg/ecoflora. You just type that into any search engine, any browser, it'll take you to the New York City EcoFlora page on the New York Botanical Gardens website. That's a great place to start. It will tell you about the EcoFlora project and have a link to our EcoQuest challenges, which is a really fun way and kind of focused way to start engaging with nature. Every month we have a different activity. We tell you a little bit about the plant and often its animal partner out in the environment, and you take sign up for the program iNaturalist that I mentioned, a wonderful, free, non-commercial, very easy to use citizen science app. It's a mobile app program for smartphones and iPads. It's also a desktop program. It's very powerful for scientists to use. You just take your smartphone outside and you look for the organism of the EcoQuest challenge for that particular month and get going. So really all you need is a camera and access to nature outside. You can even do it inside with your maybe animals you have indoors, except it's discourage pets and houseplants.
I can understand why.
Yeah.
So a few folks have asked about the boundaries of the EcoFlora project. Someone mentioned they're interested in finding native plants in Long Island on the South Shore in a very windy area. So could you talk a little bit about the boundaries of the EcoFlora and where and when people can participate in that project or in others like it?
Sure. The great thing, glad you asked this question. The great thing about iNaturalist is that it's a global program. So no matter where you are on the face of the earth, you take a picture, upload it to the program, will automatically get synced into the database and be available for researchers and any nature lovers to share your observation anywhere in the world. So it really doesn't matter where you are for your capacity and your ability to participate, observe nature, and share your love for nature with other enthusiasts anywhere in the world. For the New York City EcoFlora project, all it takes is you to be somewhere within the 5 boroughs of New York City. There are actually 5 counties. And so if your observation is made anywhere in the 5 counties, 5 boroughs of New York City, it will automatically get uploaded to the New York City EcoFlora project. So you don't have to do anything special, just have to be in New York City, which of course is a very special place. But any observation made anywhere in the world will get uploaded and be useful for research and conservation, no matter where you are.
Great. Brian asks if you could talk about the role of EcoFlora with respect to emerging invasive species.
Great question. As I mentioned, Eve Levine is a nature lover. She works in the medical field. She's not a trained biologist. She's a quintessential community scientist. She loves nature. She takes pictures. She uploads them to iNaturalist. They immediately become available to the global community. And as I mentioned, the picture that Eve Levine took of the spurge plant near her mother's apartment was immediately available to the world community. It was identified by the expert in the spurge group of plants, Nathan Taylor, down in Texas, and that got my attention once it was identified. Turns out that's a non-native species that's just shown up in New York State. So within, it was only a matter of maybe months or so that we immediately became aware of this new plant in New York City. And as we all know, New York City is the global capital for tourist trade and travel. So many things come into New York City, as we tragically are learning with this coronavirus. New York City was one of the first places that it arrived and has had devastating consequences. And the same thing has been happening with plants and animals, microorganisms, as long as New York City has been a destination. And it's the rate of introduction of these organisms has only increased over time. And that's why the title of my talk is how can we keep up with this rate of increase of introductions? And the Ecoflora model that we've developed is our best sentinel. That are only by empowering so many eyes and ears on the ground, so many community scientists all across New York City, are we able to keep track of these new introductions. Whereas in the past, it took months and months and perhaps years for botanists to become aware of this new introduction. That's how we got Japanese knotweed, bittersweet, porcelain berry, tree of heaven, Norway maple, these very aggressive and destructive invasive species were under the radar for decades and decades, spreading throughout our community before they became, before they rose to the attention of botanists. And today we have all the distributed community partners all across New York City that are helping us monitor for these potential invasives. So we are able to respond very quickly when a new potentially invasive species shows up. We're able to track it, to identify it, track it, and prevent its spread further into the community to protect our native biodiversity.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel.
Do you have? Oh, is there an echo?
Oh, is there an echo?
Just me?
Just me.
I'm still here. Do we want to take another question, or should we wrap it up?
So,
Hello?
questions about neighborhood naturalist groups, and how can you find them? How can you get involved with neighborhood groups in your area? And that kind of relates to a question we have also. Is there a group looking into Central Park?
Good question. I'm so glad you asked that, and I want to hear from you. So please send me an email if you're interested in participating in a neighborhood naturalist group. We're rolling this program out across the city, and luckily, with the support of the Institute of Museum and Library Services, we have funding now to hire an assistant to help us manage this program throughout the city. So there will be an increasing number of neighborhood naturalist groups throughout the city. We definitely want to hear from you if you're interested in participating, especially if you want to organize one. every group needs a enthusiastic leader and a champion to help motivate the group and help get it started. So we want to hear from you. Please visit our website. You can see our email addresses there. Mine is datha@nybg.org, and my colleague Brian Boom is bboom, BOOM, @nybg.org. So please send us an email with the subject Neighborhood Naturalist, and we'll help you get going with the group in your community. And what was the other part of the question?
In Central Park, is there a group?
Oh, right. Is there a group in Central Park? The Central Park is in the middle of Manhattan, and there are actually numerous community boards, community districts that surround Central Park. So there are numerous organizations that are engaged with nature, documenting nature, advocating for nature in Central Park. With my colleague Regina Alvarez and the staff members of the Central Park Conservancy, we are just publishing, it's going to come out this spring, is a catalog, a flora of all the wild plants that grow in Central Park. So that's published by the Torrey Botanical Society. You'll be able to find that online very soon. I urge you to visit the Central Park Conservancy website to learn more about what they're doing to conserve biodiversity and nature in Central Park. And there's other groups like the New York City Audubon, the Wildlife Conservation Society at the Bronx Zoo, of course, the New York Botanical Garden. And you can also send me email for additional information about Central Park.
All right, Daniel, thank you so much. I think
okay, thank you.
Out of time. We'll just close things up quickly with a few words. Vanessa, are you there?
Yes. Thank you all for attending today's presentations. If you have missed a part or you would like to see it again, thank you all for joining us today for these presentations. If you like to see any of these presentations, part of it again, please visit NYBG Humanities Institute Lecture Library. You're also warmly invited to join us next week for a new Science Humanities webinar, which is on New York City wild forests with Helen Forgione and Sarah Charlotte Powers from the Natural Areas Conservancy. Charlie.
Thank you, Vanessa. Tomorrow we continue. You can hear me good. Tomorrow we continue our Earth Day program with another online event all about how you can take action with citizen science at NYBG. If you enjoyed today's lectures, join us Saturday from 2 to 4 p.m. to learn more from other experts at NYBG about the ways you can participate in citizen science projects like these online. From observing and documenting nature to transcribing historical documents, you can take part in gathering and safeguarding knowledge about plant biodiversity and fostering a greater understanding of the natural world. So at this point, we want to thank you all for coming. We hope to have you back again soon. And until then, stay well and take care.